Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today for HyperProof's webinar on how security assurance teams can use DevOps principles to become more strategic, productive, and happier. My name is Jing Song, or JC, and I'm with HyperProof, and I'll be your host today. We're really excited to have an opportunity to have this conversation with you. And this webinar, before we get started, there's just a few housekeeping items that I like to go over. First, this is being recorded, and you will receive the recording after the presentation is over. Second, we'd love this to be a conversation and hear from you. So if you have any questions for our speakers today, please do just type them into the chat. We will have time at the end for live Q&A. I know our speakers would love to hear from you. And then let's see, with that, we can get started. I'd like to introduce to you our two speakers today, Aidan Collin and Aaron Poulsen. So Aidan is the head of enterprise business at HyperProof. And for those of you who aren't familiar, we're a compliance operations software company. In this role, Aidan works with organizations to operationalize the complicated requirements of a variety of different compliance frameworks. Before HyperProof, he's also led professional services teams at organizations including Deloitte, PwC, and Bain, and he has many years of experience in all aspects of security risk management, compliance, and IT assurance. Hi, Aidan. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, JC. Good morning.
And then our other speaker, Aaron Poulsen here. Welcome, Aaron. Aaron is HyperProof Senior Director of Information Security, Risk, and Compliance. And Aaron has over 25 years of experience working with in a variety of technical disciplines, ranging from security and software engineering to compliance and risk management. Hi, Aaron. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks, JC. Great to be here. Good morning.
Okay, I'm going to turn things over to Aidan to share more about our agenda for today.
Great. Thanks, JC. And once again, everybody, thank you for being here. On behalf of Aaron and myself, we're excited to have the opportunity to share with you some of the learnings that we've had in working with customers over the past year as they've made the transition from some of the approaches they've taken traditionally to managing compliance operations to ones that take advantage of tools and technology. And as we were talking about preparing for this webinar, Aaron and I were thinking about what are some of the key lessons that we've learned from customers over the past year. And one of the themes that came out was learning from others in organizations that have gone through significant transitions. And the one that popped out in that realm for us was the whole world of DevOps. And so we put together this webinar really to accomplish a couple of different objectives. One, and most importantly, was really just share the experiences that we've been part of over the past year with HyperProof as we've helped customers migrate some of their compliance operations to a more solid operations-based footing. And then as an element of that, recognizing the analogs between that and what DevOps is and what DevOps has accomplished for many organizations. And so we'll talk this morning about initially, what are some of the basic challenges that we see security assurance teams facing? I'll ask Aaron to give us some context around that. And then pause for a second on that. Let's talk about what DevOps is and just a very quick primer on what DevOps represents and what are some of the key principles that organizations have adopted around DevOps that have led to much more satisfactory outcomes. And then bridging those two ideas is this approach called compliance operations. We term it ComOps. And the approach here is to think about what are we trying to achieve in security assurance compliance operations? What are the principles that we can learn from the world of DevOps? How do we apply those? And so the setup for that will be, what are we trying to do with compliance operations? And what are some of the success criteria that will be important to us? We'll then go through, and Aaron and I will have a conversation around what are those DevOps principles? And how do we see them being currently applied, and how might they apply to the world of security assurance and compliance? We'll talk about the benefits that we see to doing it this way, and critically, how to get started, right? What are the first things that one might want to think about? what are some of the quicker places to get started, what are some actionable next steps. And we'll leave some time towards the tail end of the presentation to do, as JC said, answer any of your questions. We love getting questions and feedback. We're learning through this process as much as anybody else, and so we'll value any comments or feedback that you might have. So with that, that's our agenda. I'm going to ask Aaron to set the context for us around what does he see out there in working with our customers and his own extensive experience, some of the challenges that security assurance teams are focusing. Aaron.
Yep, great. Thanks, Aidan. Really appreciate the overview. And just a quick point of clarification as I get started here. I plan to refer to both compliance and security assurance teams as just assurance teams going forward. Just out of convenience is kind of a mouthful. But however, if I'm making a statement where there's a material separation between the two, I'll definitely call it out. So it's no surprise that the increasing volume and complexity of compliance frameworks has contributed to just the overall day-to-day operational challenges of assurance teams. We have regulations, industry standards, security criteria, the growing multitude of privacy frameworks that seem to just be popping up week over week, risk frameworks, environmental and social and governance frameworks. I'm missing one, geographical requirements. The list just expands every year. And these various programs, as we refer to them here collectively in HyperProof, they evolve over time. They're not static. So they're always adapting and changing with the current compliance and own threat landscape. So, a big question out there is, how do assurance teams stay current? And unfortunately, the answer to that question is oftentimes given in the form of like manual processing, which we probably all really recognize as being error prone. They're very cumbersome. They're slow. They're quite poor at scaling with increased volume and the growing complexity of these programs. So, most of us know this in a word as spreadsheets. If we're lucky, we have a good handle on our daily operations and can budget our workload accordingly. But we're assurance teams and not so lucky. So it can be difficult to predict our workload. We have meetings, we have inboxes, email inboxes, we have Slack that looks like our inboxes. There's so much, seemingly million things that we need to do and that command our attention. Something that like a canceled meeting with key stakeholders can throw our schedules off and jeopardize things like audit deliverables, which is I've never experienced that before, multiple times hypothetical scenario. We tend to mostly be reactive. And we're always looking forward to a future day when we can be more proactive with our day-to-day assurance operations.
And Aaron, I would just add to what you said there. You spoke about it in terms of your experience and some of the work that you've gone through, and you've lived all of this. I think it's fair to say that the increasing burden, as you mentioned, of additional frameworks, compliance requirements, they typically don't come with the provision of extra resources to the organization. We're asked to do much more with the same or less. And that even drives further this need to have efficiency, build in automation, and have a much stronger platform for collaboration.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Aidan. I don't know if it's a cultural phenomenon where you pass an audit successfully, whether it was just by the skin of your teeth or you had room to spare. But some of my experience is once you pass an audit, it's easy to pass other audits, and it's easier to ingest different frameworks and programs that get stood up. So yeah, I think it is a challenge for many organizations to get those resources that will allow them to scale up, again, in the way that we're accustomed to, which is largely manual, and where you have a direct relationship between this audit's work and how many people and how many person hours do you have to devote to that work. And that actually leads to the last point that I wanted to bring up as a challenge, which is the ever increasing threat, I guess we could call it, of audit fatigue and burnout. And when we think of audit fatigue, we largely think of those people in charge of coordinating and facilitating audits, whether they be internal or external. So, our compliance and our audit teams, but that fatigue extends beyond that. And it's really a fatigue that is experienced by multiple people within an organization, your networking team, your finance team, your HR team. And the reason for that is because we're constantly going to them and asking them to support audits and risk assessments and more audits, policy reviews, control management, more audits. I mean, the audits just never seem to stop. And if we replace those activities, those efforts I was just describing with coding and releasing, testing and deploying, I guess not in that order, it wasn't too long ago that software engineers were running into kind of the same scalability issues as assurance teams. And it's not that today's software engineers have an excessive amount of time on their hands, but they did adapt to both external and internal pressures in streamlining and improving the software development process. And that kind of brings us to the slide we're looking at right now, which is DevOps. So the quote from Rackspace, you see here on the slide, DevOps integrates developers and operations teams. And we're going to see some of these terms repeated over and over again. These are kind of the key elements that we'd like to focus on. DevOps integrates developers and operations teams in order to improve collaboration and productivity by automating infrastructure, automating workflows, and continuously measuring application performance. I love that automating is mentioned twice. I think that underscores the importance to automation in a successful DevOps implementation. But here we see that the adaptation that I mentioned earlier from the software engineering world is really manifested in DevOps. It's a framework tightly coupled with the values and principles of agile development. It's really difficult, in fact, to mention one without mentioning the other. DevOps is very much focused on, and I know this is probably a review for some, but it's good to mention that DevOps is really focused on producing good software. It's focused on producing that quickly in tightly managed increments. So if you've ever heard of sprints, that's what we're talking about here. And it's directed, it's intentional. And what I mean by that is, with the short release cycles, these sprints will typically be 2 to maybe 4 weeks. 4 weeks is actually kind of pushing it on the longer end of things. But with the sprints, there really is there's less likelihood of scope creep, and a lot of the ailments that affected the sort of the antithesis of DevOps and Agile in the waterfall method, where you had to complete a discrete set of activities before moving on to the next stage, and then moving on to the next stage, to the point where once you've released a product enhancement, your requirements more than likely changed. Your code may be stale at that point, and ultimately what you deliver is not meeting the current business requirements. So one of the biggest benefits I see with DevOps is you shorten those release cycles, you deliver benefits. It's very customer centric, as we're seeing here at the key principles, and you're adding value quicker. I actually like to think of DevOps as you're really doing less, but you're doing it faster and better to achieve optimal results. Probably not the best definition, but I always think of it's a chunking down, it's a breaking apart these deliverables, so you get there incrementally faster. We mentioned automating, we mentioned continuously measuring. One of the key components of DevOps is it's not siloed. So you have cross-functional autonomous teams, and you have that end-to-end responsibility where you're not just having engineers release code to your IT or your sysadmins to deploy, but it's all part of the process. The business is very much in a collaborative role. In fact, they drive a lot of this. They collect the requirements, and they're the ones making the request based on what customers are telling us. Continuous improvement, not just in the process, but if you can't fit something into this sprint, you're not waiting 6 months to fit it into the next sprint, because the next sprint starts in 3 weeks. So you're continuously evaluating and prioritizing the most impactful deliverables for your customers. And then, of course, you automate everything you can. We're fortunate that technology has advanced and is now keeping pace with some of the business velocity we're seeing, where we can leverage things like version control and source code repositories that can trigger activities like code testing, security testing. It can trigger using orchestration tools where you're standing up. You're not just deploying code, you're actually standing up entire environments that your code will reside in, and that becomes your release. So that automation part is very key. And then, like DevOps, ComOps embraces a number of these same principles. JC, can we go to the next slide?
Okay, I got it.
All right, thanks, Aiden.
No, that's a perfect setup, Aaron, really is. And I like the fact that you called out a couple of key principles, and as you said it words that repeated within the definition. You talked about agile, the ability to go through things quickly, to chunk things out. And I think sometimes in the world of compliance and security assurance, we get so overwhelmed by the big outcomes that we're trying to achieve that we get overwhelmed, and we want to be able to break those down. So thinking about it through an agile lens, thinking about it through a sprint lens is important. You talked about collaboration, the end-to-end responsibility for the desired outcome, and you talked about automation. And thinking about those principles and that definition of DevOps, it got us to thinking about at HIPAA-Proof, how does that apply to the world of security assurance, security compliance? And the translation that we make is that the analog is for us this thing called compliance operations. And the idea that many of those self-same outcomes are desirable outcomes for us to have in compliance. Many of the self-same principles have broad applicability within compliance. And it feels like we have a lot to learn from the world of DevOps. We want to take advantage of that. And so our starting point is to say that we believe there's a compliance operations discipline that is very much informed by agile thinking. It's involved by breaking things down, by addressing a single audit or a single risk or a single control, and being able to mindfully move through the landscape that faces us and addressing and moving one of those elements forward. We're not trying to change the entire world in a waterfall-like fashion. We're trying to iteratively work through and make our environment better. And that discipline, it integrates the teams that are responsible for both the process and the outcomes. It works to strive to improve collaboration in an easy way. One of the comments, Aaron, that you made was that we were used to seeing engineers hand something off to sysadmins where they would have to do something in their world. The equivalent for us in ComOps is that we have business stakeholders that we may interact with very infrequently through the year. We need to meet them where they are. And so, for example, if we're asking them to provide us with something, we have a responsibility to ask them once and reuse it as much as possible. And we have a responsibility to make it easy for them to provide something to us in a world, in an environment that they're used to. They're not learning new tool sets just for us. So we've got to meet them, whether they're the engineer living in Jira or somebody receiving a Slack message as their normal communications vehicle. That's how they should interact with us. And then automating as much of that as possible, taking away the redundant manual processing by ensuring that we're measuring what's going on, looking at it critically and improving it. And then as a collective organization, making the process better, adding more automation over time, recognizing that it's a journey, that we're not going to resolve all of the issues we have right away, and recognizing that one of the success measures that we'll have is what Aaron alluded to, is how can we move from reactive to proactive? We'll feel better if we're approaching an audit that just popped up on our radar screen, and we feel good about it. We feel like we're in a good position to handle this audit. Or if one of our product owners decides that we want to move into a different market, and that market or that customer has some new compliance framework requirements for us. We know we're about 70% of the way done. We have a view into that allows us to calmly respond. Yes, we can deal with that, and it'll take us 3 months to get there, rather than we don't know, let us go explore. And so those are rather the kind of outcomes that we're striving for. And to be able to say that, to be able to get to there, our hypothesis further is that anything that we term compliance operations has to be intuitive. It has to be easy to use. It has to be easy to implement. It's got to be easy to get started with, both for professional practitioners in the world of risk and compliance and control, and for our business stakeholders. It's got to feel easy for them to engage with us. I mentioned earlier that it has to work with stakeholders where they are. We can't expect them in their busy day-to-day world to suddenly take on a new control responsibility that feels very different than the stuff they're doing every day. So we have to meet them where they are. Any tooling that we bring in, any methodology that we bring in, any process that we bring in has to work and scale with a broader organization. So we've got to be able to plug into the world as organizations have it, and then be able to leverage and scale up based upon being part of that ecosystem. And it was said multiple times on the last slide, we'll say it again here, it has to automate as much as possible. The days of us going and extracting the same evidence for slightly different audit requests and having somebody in the organization pull for us a file somewhere that we know it exists in an environment, and why can't we get it in an automatic way? That's the world we're moving to, and that's where our stakeholders will expect us to be. And it's honestly the only way that we'll be able to manage the scaling up of the set of requirements that Aaron talked about at the beginning. Aaron, you've had a lot of experience both in the DevOps world and now increasingly in the ComOps world. As you see the two disciplines in parallel, anything else you'd want to add in terms of what we can learn from the world and the experience of DevOps?
I really like one of the points you bring up, Aidan, which is we're not trying, and I'm paraphrasing, but we're not trying to solve everything all at once. We're not trying to change the world all at once. With everything else that's going on around us, we really don't have much choice. I mean, the decision has almost been made for us as assurance teams that we have to implement incremental improvements wherever we can. And so any efficiencies we gain, I hate saying low-hanging fruit, but that's kind of what we're doing, is wherever we can make an impact and slowly give back time to our assurance teams, will have a snowball effect over time. We'll actually start realizing the benefits of this, probably not even seeing it happen right away, but maybe a month from now, 2 months from now, suddenly evidence collection is not as cumbersome. Coordinating audits is not quite the effort it used to be. And I just think that was a really good point to bring up, which is this whole idea and this marrying of the DevOps to ComOps principle of continuous improvement, I think is really impactful.
Good, Aaron, thank you. And I think that's actually a nice setup for this first principle that we want to talk about here. And you talked about it at the beginning, Aaron, around the dev and ops teams sharing responsibility for the right outcome. And that's, in many respects, maybe the foundational principle around DevOps, the idea that we bring these disciplines together, these teams together, and we focus on getting to the right outcomes. The analog for us then in compliance operations is that we have our security assurance teams, our compliance teams. We have business stakeholders in IT and engineering and sysadmin and finance and HR and everywhere else across the organization. Traditionally, there's been a disconnect in the sense that as practitioners in risk and compliance, we take strong ownership of the fact that we want to make sure the organization is best positioned to meet either externally imposed compliance requirements or just generally good business practice. We own that responsibility. We're proud of it. And our business stakeholders have fed into that and they've asked for outcomes. But there's been a disconnect. And we're going to argue that one of the key principles of ComOps is whatever we can do, and this is to your point, Aaron, around incrementally addressing the problem very tactically, anything that we can do to bring those groups together will have long-lasting effects in terms of efficiency and goodwill, candidly. And so how do you do that? What's something basic that we can do? One of the most basic things we can do is we can get everybody working in the same place. We can have all of our control information, all of our evidence collection in one place. And we can have the ability for our security assurance compliance practitioners to work in that platform, to work in that process, to task from it, and then engage our business stakeholders where they're leveraging their world, be that Jira for an IT engineer or an email portal or whatever other world they're comfortable in. And then that stakeholder using that process to interact with whatever world we have within compliance and security assurance, but having that one shared set of information, shared set of controls and descriptions and evidence, and then critically being able to, over time, add more and more content to that so that we're asking for less and less from our stakeholders. We're not asking them repeatedly for the same kinds of information. Aaron, anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I really like, Aidan, the calling out the shared responsibility component of this, because unless you're actually effective in assigning ownership to various parts of security and compliance, you know, we talk about the controls. If a control owner doesn't know they're the owner, they don't know they're responsible. They don't know what they're accountable for. And that might be due in part. Actually, the ownership question is probably its own topic, but as far as the shared responsibility, security has done a really good job socializing throughout organizations that it really is everyone's responsibility, you know, collectively. Compliance, not so much, and maybe it's because when there's a large security gap, that makes headlines, not so much with compliance, but we're seeing that change, where if you have a compliance gap, that is more and more making its rounds in the newspapers and the news feeds. So the idea of shared responsibility is really a key component of the DevOps and Commons, you know, for making this effective.
Now you just triggered something for me as well, Aaron. I'm thinking about one of our customers. When we talked to them originally, one individual there was spending a good chunk of their time every day thinking about, who do I need to call to get something done? Who in the business needs to test a control? We have an audit coming up. What evidence am I missing? And in HIPAA-proof, as you know, we refer to that as the nagging and reminding functionality. And it surprised me, honestly, how much time is spent on doing that. And then how much fatigue that creates for practitioners who've got to just remember to do all this stuff. The more that we can systemize that, not only does it reinforce your comment, Aaron, around in ownership, it also lets our stakeholders have clear understanding of what we need from them, and having clear visibility in their responsibilities, limited as they might be and infrequent as they might be. But the fact that they can see this, they understand it very clearly. We have visibility, the exceptions that has to be part of any process or tooling that we build to support ComOps. And that leads us nicely, I think, into the second principle that you talked about initially, Aaron, around DevOps, the idea of smaller chunks. And you said it, you described it as chunking things out. And I started my career many, many years ago when waterfall development was the way we went. And I worked on many 2-year projects that lasted for 5 years because we had so much that we were trying to accomplish. And we were afraid many times to go back and ask for refreshed requirements because requirements change so frequently. We knew we couldn't keep up. And as most people here, I think, will appreciate, that's how we got to the word of agile. That's how we got to the sense of, let's have smaller things to do. Let's have better defined outcomes. Let's agree upon those, and let's strive to get those outcomes done and capture the value and the optionality around what we're building way more quickly. And the logical connection then to ComOps is moving from a world where it feels like we have to do everything and we don't know what's going to happen next. and we're a little apprehensive and sometimes a little scared that something comes along. We're not necessarily well positioned to respond to a business stakeholder's request that asks us for a perspective on when will we be ready to do X. Can we get to thinking about a new product introduction in a new market? And so being able to chunk out our world, first of all, implies an understanding of it, implies an understanding of what are the controls, what are the frameworks, what are the audits, what are the risks, what's the evidence, and then in a sprint, agile kind of way of thinking, making iterative improvements. And a good example here is taking a single control. We've got a control defined. We have a control owner, Aaron mentioned. We understand what testing needs to happen on that control, with what frequency. Can we do something to automate that control? And maybe it's an easy one. Maybe we're looking for a password parameter file from AWS. And rather than having to remind somebody every month to give me that in prep for an audit or a control test, let me see if I can automate that. If I can do just that one thing in a sprint, then I've achieved something. And I've made the environment iteratively better. And I can now forget about that. That piece is done. I don't need to come back and revisit it. And that's a key DevOps principle, right? We build something, it's done. Now we'll change going forward, we'll add, we'll learn, we'll refresh requirements. But the thing that we did is finished. And I think applying that thinking to the world of security assurance and compliance is critically important to be able to get control of the environment. Aaron, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Aidan. One point I'd like to make, which I think is so crucial when you're talking about working iteratively, is that we don't want to paralyze ourselves with an overall objective of as an example, all of our controls need to have owners. Well, what if we have 500 controls that we're trying to manage and maintain? We don't want to look at that as a huge project. There's no way we could get that done before our next audit, so we're going to focus our time on something else. There's no reason why we can't start identifying control owners for a subset of those controls and just start working there. So yes, maybe we may not have all of the control owners assigned, again, in this example, by the time the next audit comes around, but we could have some part of that taken care of and communicated out to those control owners. And while it hasn't really alleviated our burden immediately, we'll start seeing the impact of that, possibly a month from now, 2 months from now, and realizing the benefits, again, incrementally and through this iterative process over time.
Yeah, and I want to, at the risk of overstating this, I'm going to overstate it anyway. Having been on the receiving end, having sat on audit committees and on other board committees where I would receive reports of progress against risk or control or compliance, the one thing I think I never heard was, here's the progress we've made against fixing something that we will not have to revisit. And it may sound simple to say that, but I would have loved to have heard a storyline that said, we understand our broad environment. Here's all the controls we have. Here's all the risks. In the past 2 weeks, we've moved these 5 controls from a maturity level of 1, which is we barely know about the control, maybe to maturity level of 3, where we have a control owner defined, we have a testing protocol well understood, we understand the frequency of it, we're starting to ingest some of the evidence. That story would have been powerful. And one of the feedback points I would often give either our internal or external assessors or auditors was that I wanted to see that. I wanted to see progress. It's not perfection, but it's getting us somewhere along a path. And Aaron, to just what you said, it's not being afraid to iteratively pick something small, make it better, and tell that story. So the more that we do of that, the less stress we'll have in our world, stressful as it is already, and the more likelihood we'll have to inspire confidence in our senior management teams that we are making progress against a very challenging goal. Aaron, you said on your DevOps comments, automate, automate, automate. And we're going to reinforce that concept here. JC, one of your roles with us was to lead our IT compliance survey. and the benchmarking work that you did last year was very informative. And one of the elements that came out of that benchmark survey last year was that about 50% of the time of the respondents was spent on routine work, whether that's the reminding that I mentioned earlier on, or managing email workflows with auditors, or tracking down why somebody didn't respond to a request. The more that we can automate, the better. And DevOps does that well. And what we've seen in the DevOps landscape over the past couple of years is the recognition and the development of really smart tooling around each piece of that process. What that means for us in the compliance and insurance world is that we should, A, have a principle of gather once and reuse. And the more that we can do with everything that we have, so a control that meets requirements across multiple frameworks, for instance, or common controls, that's an element of automation. How we can collect evidence automatically, so extract from AWS Security Hub the kinds of data that we need to support testing, and then provision that for our auditors. That's automation. Setting up workflows that have repeating and recurring tasks, or have tasks that need to occur if something happens around an audit. All of that is automation, and doing and building that again over time. This is not a big bang of trying to solve the problem with one huge effort. It's recognizing that one task at a time, one automation at a time will get us there. And will also, as I said earlier, continue to instill confidence in our business stakeholders and our senior management teams that we are making the world better one step at a time, and moving away from this very reactive posture that we're typically in to one where we have a sense of what our workload is. Aaron, anything you want to add to that?
I think there's so much that could be added around this automation topic. Automation is a trigger word for some people. It is kind of for me as well. And that's mostly because, automation has been defined in such a wide variety of ways, to the point where I've been in conversations where there's a belief that your entire compliance operations could be automated. And I think when automation, and we've probably had, some of these discussions where why can't we just automate, everything? Well, not everything is automatable. However, there are components that absolutely can be automated. And those are the things we should be focusing on, and just being very careful and deliberate with how we define automation and where it can really add value to an organization. There's a lot of room in compliance and with our assurance teams to leverage automation. And my point here is just to be careful when we use the word automation, that we're not giving the impression, and I don't believe we on this call have this issue. It's more around executive team communication, that automation can absolutely help us. And to your point that you brought up, Aiden, it would be great to show where we're actually applying automation and the gains we're receiving from it. And then just being transparent that we can't automate everything, but what we've identified we can automate, we are slowly implementing those types of scripts or evidence polls or whatever it may be, and reporting that back up. I think that communication piece is really important.
Good, and that's a key point, Aaron. Thanks for that sensitivity around automation. I read a lot about organizations that will talk about automating their controls environment, and I'm skeptical. As a reformed auditor, I think about the complexity of some of the audit tests that I want to perform. And I don't want to be constrained by somebody else's definition of that testing. And I think the audit community, the assessor community, will always want to evolve ways to test that automation can certainly support, but probably can't, certainly at this stage, can't replace.
Yeah.
Then the final principle that we wanted to bring out was around how do you collect data to monitor the process and then make continuous improvement. We talked about it, and Aaron talked about it in the DevOps context, to be able to look at how do we understand the processes that we have, how do we make them better, how do we measure and adjust. And applying the same kind of thinking to ComOps, then the idea would be that we would be continuously tracking risks in the business, and then how are those risks measured? And I sometimes jokingly say that I made a good living out of doing bad risk assessments in my earlier career. And what I mean by that is that we oftentimes have an approach around risk that's somewhat static. We'll assess the risk and we'll understand it, but we don't always make the link to controls in operation. And so one of the principles that we'd call out here is to say, really our measure of how well we are implementing ComOps, how well we're getting and driving to the right kinds of outcomes, is how well we're measuring and managing risk, and how well those risks over time reflect the control work that we're doing. Are we doing a better job of managing them? Are we doing a better job of mitigating them to the greatest extent possible? And what that means then further is the audit has a purpose around independent review, but we're also, from a ComOps perspective, thinking all the time about, with the support of automation, with the support of good technology and tooling, how can we be ahead of that? How can we be testing controls, some of them in the context of being automated for their testing, others not? How do we lever up and be able to think about gathering and collecting the data that allows us to assess the ongoing progress of risk in the organization? Because that's typically the lens, again, that many of our senior management team, our boards will want to look at as their measure of how we're doing our work. Are we reducing risk for the enterprise? Aaron, anything you want to add to that?
Just, it all comes down to this, Aidan, and this is kind of one of my favorite points, which is our assurance teams are really there to reduce the risk for the organization. And it's such a key principle. It helps define, the things that if we don't have time to perform all of our audit functions, we only have a finite amount of hours in the day, let's say, where do we devote those hours? And it really should be devoted to what has the greatest impact on mitigating risk for the company. And I think that informs us of our next activities when it comes to, well, is there any part of that we can automate? Or if I only have, and even if it's a manual process, where do I devote that manual process and that time and effort to? Well, hopefully we've identified where those key risks are for our company, and that's where we focus our time. Good.
Well stated, Aaron. And so we've talked about how we think about the analog between DevOps and ComOps. We've talked about some application of the principles, and this may well just be the inverse of what Aaron said at the beginning. But why would we do this? And I'll just say in summary, it's to address many of the issues that Aaron brought up at the beginning. It's to reduce the routine admin work. It's to give ourselves a better sense of predictability and proactivity. It's to be better in terms of reducing risk and managing compliance. Aaron, what would you add to that? You've experienced the other side of it. How do you see these benefits applying to the world that you've lived in?
I'm really seeing this as a method for people to get out, and by people, I mean assurance, security and assurance teams, compliance assurance teams, to really get out of that day-to-day trap of we're just trying to manage to tomorrow. It's really a methodology that we could follow, this framework of iterative improvement, where we can start getting time back and we can start getting control back. And it won't happen overnight. It's something that'll take some time, but at least we're making forward progress into those incremental improvements and realizing those benefits. So we are in more control of what we're doing day to day. We aren't being proactive. We'll actually start making time to, we aren't being reactive. That's all we're doing right now. We're being more proactive with how we manage our time and reducing that overall risk posture of the company.
Good. So we promised at the beginning we would get to some actionable ideas. We've shared what we think the challenges are, where we think the benefits of taking this approach are. So how do you do it? So here's our thinking around some ideas to get started with. We use this term a lot, having a single source of truth, but having a single place where we are able to capture and work on, and it's not a spreadsheet, where we have captured the assurance and risk information that we need and the workflows, where we bring together the key linking element, which is the control. So we worry about controls and evidence and testing, and then using that control to satisfy a myriad of different needs, audits, compliance frameworks, risk management and mitigation. Having a single place to work in that, having a single source of truth that allows us to build collaboration, allows us to gain efficiency. I talked earlier about multiple use of, for example, controls across frameworks, enables us to get to that, enables us to gather and collate evidence and reuse it and not have to re-ask for the same thing. So having a single source of truth, we think, is important. Aaron, you've talked about, when you talked about the DevOps process, you talked about the change management processes that's in there. You talked about how they've standardized around that. What's your thinking around the applicability of that within ComOps then?
It's crucial. You have to know basic things like owners. You have to know what things are being done, what activities are being done to support the organization, what activities are being done that relate to the controls that ultimately, as assurance teams, we have to manage and report back on. I was thinking, Aidan, as you were talking, that it sounds very basic, where we mention a single source of truth, but in practice, it's startling how, for example, policy documents just seem to do a walkabout, where the most current business continuity plan, for example, may not be where you thought it was. It's living in some other repository. And so being able to corral documents, policies, evidence files, processes, whatever, into a common repository that constitutes your single source of truth is really key, because until you have that, you don't really know the full landscape of what you're in charge of managing.
That's a good point, Aaron, and it leads to really what you talked about in the DevOps world of automation. There's an old saying in consulting, in process consulting, if you have a mess, don't automate the mess, because you just end up with an automated mess. And some of the similar logic would apply here, right? The idea that if we want to apply collaboration and automation, we want to drive efficiency through the use of automation particularly, then we have to have some of that standardized language, some of that standardized taxonomy, some of that standardized process in place. And so being very mindful about defining our control management protocol, defining the language we're using, defining who's a controller or what's a controller, or what are the attributes of controls that are important to us. We anchor on the control for the reason I mentioned earlier. It really is the foundation and building block for the outcomes we're looking for around either risk mitigation or compliance management, or being responsive to audits. So once we standardize on that, once we have our well-defined approach, then it sets us up for being able to mindfully go through and say, okay, what can we automate? What can we automate either in terms of just evidence extraction? And then what can we automate in terms of tasking? What's the routines around this control? What can we automate in terms of reporting? What can we automate in terms of control testing? So to your point, Aaron, not knowing that, not knowing the basics of what our controls look like and what the workflow around them is, means we really can't step forward to do these kinds of activities that give us a big return. And the last point I think we'll make is that start simple. It's been a common theme, I think you'll have heard from Aaron and my comments, that we want to get out of this sense of being overwhelmed. And Aaron and I both work with many of our customers where that starting point is, there's just so much to get done. And there's new stuff happening all the time. Some stuff we don't even know about is about to hit us. So being able to step back and pause and say, okay, what can we tick off one at a time? And the only way we can take that approach is to have a standardized approach around controls in terms of the taxonomy and description and workflows. And then let's start to automate what we can. And we'll do one at a time. And communicating to the organization that that's the process that we're going through. I'll talk to many CISOs and I'll advise them that when they're talking to their CIOs, the more that they can use agile language, the more it will resonate, because that CIO is more than likely either in the throes of building or executing an agile approach to the broader development operations world that they're overseeing. And so talking in an agile sprint language to the rest of the organization, specifically to IT, and then to beyond, makes it just resonate. It says that we're operating in a way that's recognized as one that yields good results. And so starting with simple automations, being able to just simply do the automated reminding and nagging that we talk about, being able to remind people to do whatever tasks we need from them around submitting evidence, extracting, to Aaron's point, the most recent version of the disaster recovery plan, finding that and having it available. And then every time it changes, being able to automatically include that. Those kinds of simple automations actually have a big return, and they also just remove a level of stress from us. And then the last point, we talk about categorization. As we ingest and understand evidence over time, then we'll learn. We'll learn that this is the kind of evidence from this control that actually has use somewhere else. And it's the same evidence that the auditor from this firm asked for last year, so now it's available for the next audit. And we'll learn and we'll add, we'll be able to organize the evidence that we're collecting, and then link that directly to controls, so that that is available to the compliance frameworks, the audits, the risks that depend upon those controls. Aaron, anything you want to add in as we wrap up here?
Yeah, I think this is my favorite slide of the presentation. I really like this. Really just encompasses to me what the core principles of DevOps and ComOps really come down to is start simple and start with simple automations. The thing I really like about this is once you have started that process and you have created these simple automations, it doesn't have to be much, but aggregately over time, you're going to start seeing these benefits. Plus, it sets us up for what everyone I think is really keen on. How do we now evolve that automation to testing? And it's not something we're touching on in this presentation, but it's where everyone wants to go, is once we've automated some of the basic operations within our compliance and our assurance programs. Now, how can we automate it even further? And the logical extension of that would be we can perform testing on certain things, not everything, obviously, but those things that we can test. Now, let's start finding solutions for those. So it really advances the whole assurance team effort. And I think it's a good slide to go out on.
Good. That's a nice way to wrap this up. With that, we'll provide some links to some resources here. And anything that we've talked about generally is captured here. We'll direct you to those, and happy to get feedback as you have a chance to look at some of those resources if they're relevant to you. With that, I think, Jesse, I'll hand back to you. There you go. Jesse, we're not hearing you.
I was on mute.
There you go.
Okay. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Aiden. This is really helpful, especially hearing about kind of your concrete experiences managing these security assurance tasks and audits. One question we have coming in is, do you have more specific examples of types of automation where those things have saved time for you, Aaron?
Yeah. So again, this probably isn't anything that will wow anyone unless you're in the compliance area, which for me was pretty exciting. Simple things like pulling in user lists from different services. So if you have, if you're utilizing cloud services like AWS or Azure, you can pull in user lists. Even something as simple and seems trivial of making a request to an IT department to go out and when they have time, pull that information for you, put it in the right place, let you know it's there. That stuff takes time. And so having something that's automated where it's either on a set schedule or you could trigger a pull to grab that data, it doesn't sound like much, but it really adds up. And so that's, for me, that's one of the more obvious examples. Also tying into something like GitHub to identify, for these pull requests, did we note that there was a reviewer and an approver as part of the process? That will all be manifested in a pull from GitHub. And again, those things take time requesting as part of the communication and messaging process to your support teams. So being able to automate that and have those connections established is pretty amazing, especially when you're juggling multiple audits where they're not using the same evidence. So maybe, for example, in the GitHub example, it's like, okay, we know this repository, we've collected that information, but for this other audit, it's another repository where that information is, where it resides, and maybe you need to contact another engineering team. So being able to automate those types of pulls is really helpful.
I would just add to that, Aaron, the one that we see some of our customers get excited about as well is automating the tasks that somebody has to do who's outside of compliance. So somebody in IT or in engineering has to do something. I mentioned it earlier about they should see that in their world. And so we can set up an automation. So for example, where an engineer in an organization doesn't have to respond to a request to us from an email that they get from us, that they get 1,000 emails, but rather they see a ticket in Jira because they live in Jira, and they'll more naturally absorb that into their daily workflow than they will by going out a channel and trying to deal with an email request. And so thinking about how do we automate and then meet that user where they are, I think for many of our customers, that's proved very valuable and time saving because the work gets done more efficiently.
Thank you. Our next question. My company has done SOC 2 Type 2, and now we're looking at ISO 2007-1. Can the ComOps approach make that process easier?
I would say hell yes, but you'd expect me to say that. Let me tell you why. I think a couple of principles that come out that are important. One, reuse. And so the idea of, if you look at SOC 2 and ISO 27001 specifically, there's significant overlap. And so intuitively, we should be able to look at the work we've done for SOC 2 and say, that's got to meet some of the requirements, but exactly what does it meet? And so being able to parse that out is very important. So ComOps absolutely helps that. And secondly, the reuse of the evidence and testing of those controls that we're going to reuse means that we obviate the need to go off and do that again. And then thirdly, the reporting around it, being able to see and have visibility into what work needs to be done to meet the additional requirements. That's where ComOps comes around. And Aaron talked about it in the DevOps example of being very transparent. That's where ComOps would also support you.
Yeah, that's actually a very timely question too. I don't know if we can plug another webinar, but there's one, I'm going to do it anyway. There's one this Friday where we actually address that topic of, so you have your SOC 2 and you're considering ISO. We're partnering with Shellman to explain how that process looks and how the ComOps principles, from our perspective of Hyperproof, how that will help. One of the big ones, if you've done any research on ISO 27001, is the creation and management of your ISMS. And we absolutely help with that, with the ComOps principles, and can maintain that within Hyperproof. And it's, to Aidan's point, that reusability of evidence, of controls, identifying how far along you already are in the process, going from SOC 2 to ISO, that is all presented through the use of Hyperproof.
Thank you. I think we're just about out of time. And so with that, I'd like to say thank you to everyone on the call. We really appreciate that you took the time out of your day to spend some time with us. And I know that Aaron and Aidan are, they're passionate about this topic. And so if you have any questions, they're certainly open to having further conversations with you. With that, I want to thank Aaron and Aidan for all the time you spent and thinking about this topic and preparing this. So thank you so much. And we hope to see you next time.
Indeed. Thanks, Jesse.
Thank you, JC. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.